Today, Russia is a country which has many territorial disputes with many of their neighbors. The most infamous of these disputes that we've all been paying attention to recently are the ones with Ukraine. Russia claims the Crimean Peninsula, which they annexed from Ukraine in 2014. The Russian president has questioned Ukraine's entire right to independence, and the Russian armed forces are currently invading and occupying large amounts of the country's territory. And while this dispute is certainly the largest and the most hostile of the Russian government, it is far from the only one. For thousands of miles away across to the other side of Eurasia, there is another brewing just beneath the surface in the headlines between Russia and Japan over the status of these 4 islands, all 4 of which are currently ruled from Moscow but claimed intensely by Tokyo as their so-called northern territories. 2 weeks following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida declared that these 4 islands are a territory peculiar to Japan, and a territory in which Japan has sovereignty. And then the following day, the Japanese Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi declared the islands as an integral part of Japan. And it's not like they just came out of the blue and claimed these islands for themselves after Russia suddenly became distracted with a war over in Europe. The Japanese government has been claiming these islands for decades, and for nearly 80 years now, both them and the United States government have considered these islands as Russian-occupied territory of Japan. And even more insane is that because they consider these islands occupied, the Japanese and Russians have never, in nearly 80 years, actually got around to signing a formal peace treaty ending World War II between them, which means that, legally speaking, the Second World War is still ongoing between Russia and Japan over the status of these tiny islands. And in response to Japan's economic sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has announced that they're now fully withdrawing from all of the peace treaty talks with Japan that have been going on for nearly 80 years now. So, what is it about these tiny little islands between them that they each consider so valuable? Why have they prevented peace between them for this long? And who between them is actually the rightful controller? In order to answer those questions, we have to rewind the clock back a bit to the mid-19th century. Back at that time, Japan was just coming out from a period of more than 2.5 centuries of near complete isolation from the outside world, and was just moving settlers and soldiers into the northern territories of Hokkaido and the Kuril Island chain, while simultaneously, the Russian Empire's own settlers and soldiers were encroaching onto the shores of the northern Pacific, Sakhalin Island, and the Kuril Islands as well. Formal diplomatic relations between the Russian Empire and the Tokugawa Shogunate of Japan were first made back in 1855, largely as a way to resolve their conflicting colonial interests in the Kurils. As a result, they signed the Treaty of Shimoda, which divided the Kuril Islands across this line, with the Russians controlling all of the islands to the north and the Japanese controlling the 4 islands to the south, which they called Etorofu, Kunashiri, Shikotan, and the Habamai Islands, the 4 that are currently under dispute today. At the same time, the treaty stated that the nearby Sakhalin or Karafuto Island would not be partitioned between them, and would be jointly ruled as a Russian-Japanese condominium. Then, 20 years later after that treaty in 1875, Russia and Japan came to a new agreement in the Treaty of St. Petersburg. They basically agreed that Russia would gain full control of Sakhalin, in exchange for Japan gaining full control over all of the Kuril Islands, stretching to right off of the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Russian mainland, which for reasons I'll get into later, was an absolutely terrible trade for Japan. So far, though, all of these territories had been agreed to through means of peace and diplomacy. But that would all change at the beginning of the 20th century. Russia and Japan's territorial ambitions and goals were beginning to cross over each other at just too many places. The Russians didn't have any ports of their own on the Pacific that remained ice-free during the winter, locking down their naval and trade capabilities across the entire coastline for the whole season. Thus, the Russians were attempting to expand towards warmer waters into Manchuria and Korea, and managed to acquire a lease from the Qing dynasty on Port Arthur in China's Liaodong Peninsula, which crucially did remain ice-free even during the winter. Unfortunately for them, the Japanese at the time were also seeking to expand their own empire into this exact direction as well. Japan initially offered a compromise similar to the one that they had made with Russia earlier over Sakhalin and the Kurils, Russian control over Manchuria in exchange for Japanese control over Korea. But this time, Russia refused and offered only a division of Korea with Japan across the 39th parallel, just 1 degree north of what would ultimately become the dividing line between North and South Korea today. Japan refused and decided to launch a surprise attack against the Russian Navy anchored in Port Arthur, which began the 18-month-long Russo-Japanese War. Despite all hope of victory over Japan dissolving within months, the Tsar continued on the war anyway in order to avoid suffering what he called a humiliating peace. In 1905, the war was finally concluded with a decisive Japanese victory by the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ceded the southern half of Sakhalin over to Japan, among other things. Over the next 4 decades, hundreds of thousands of Japanese colonists migrated into the southern half of Sakhalin from the Japanese main islands, and the Japanese Empire initiated a rapid series of military conquests across the rest of Asia and the Pacific. But peace with Russia, for the most part, was well maintained. This was, however, controversial within Japan itself. At the time, pre-World War II, the fascist Japanese government largely debated between 2 different aggressive foreign policy choices: a northern expansion doctrine advocating for an invasion and conquest of the Soviet Union's far eastern lands largely promoted by the Japanese army, or a southern expansion doctrine advocating for an invasion and conquest of the Western colonial possessions across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, largely promoted by the Japanese Navy. Before a decision either way had been reached, millions of Japanese and Soviet soldiers faced each other across the frontier of Japanese-occupied Manchuria and the Russian Far East, anticipating each other's moves and occasionally coming to blows. But in April of 1941, the Japanese and the Soviets signed a 5-year-long non-aggression pact, and then, just 3 months later after that, the Western Allies and United States imposed a total oil embargo on Japan. This action was critical for influencing the course of world events, because the Japanese home islands are incredibly barren of fossil fuel energy resources like oil or gas, and at the time of the war, more than 80% of Japan's oil consumption was being imported. Without the oil, Japan's war machine running in China would have quickly run out of fuel, and so they ultimately decided to attack using the southern expansion doctrine towards the islands of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, which at the time were known to have large numbers of oil reserves. Little did they know at the time that some of the largest oil reserves in the entire world were actually, in fact, located just to the north on the island of Sakhalin, an island that they already controlled the entire southern half of. There is more than 5 times as much oil in these reserves than in the entirety of Indonesia combined. But of course, the Soviets weren't aware of any of that at the time either, as it wouldn't really be discovered and developed until much later on in the 1990s. Had Japan or the Soviets known about these reserves back at the time, it could have heavily influenced their military's decision-making into pursuing the northern expansion strategy into the Soviet Union instead, with unpredictable alternate history. But that's not how things went. Instead, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and went to war against America, Britain, and the other Western allies, while the Soviet Union fought on against Nazi Germany in Europe. But they never directly engaged each other until the very final moments of the war. The non-aggression pact that they had signed was supposed to last until the 6th of April, 1946. But in April of 1945, as the Red Army was closing in on Berlin in Europe, the Soviets suddenly renounced the pact. And then, just 2 days after the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima in August, the Soviet Union formally declared war on Japan and launched a full-scale invasion into Japanese-occupied Manchuria, Korea, the southern half of Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. Japan announced their surrender just 1 week after the Soviet declaration of war. But then, 3 days after that, the Soviets began their amphibious invasion of the Kuril Islands. Japan formally signed peace on the 2nd of September, but by that point, the entirety of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands had come under Soviet occupation. All of the hundreds of thousands of Japanese settlers in these territories were subsequently forcefully deported by the Soviets back to the Japanese mainland, and hundreds of thousands of mostly Russian and Ukrainian settlers have since moved in to replace them in the decades that have followed.